started because I think there might be a class in here at 3 o'clock. So we got to get out of Dodge pretty quick. I'm Dr. David Solomon. I'm the new Director of Undergraduate Research and Creative Activity. I've met some folks. My office is 2 floors below us here, 161. And we're going to be having an open house for what we call the OURCA, O-U-R-C-A, which is Office of Undergraduate Research and Creative Activity, on Halloween. There'll be a lot of publicity for it. It's going to be in the afternoon from 1 to 5. Come in costume. We'll have stuff to give away and tell you a little bit more about what we're doing. So, yeah.
Free stuff.
So I wanted to start this workshop series where once a month we do some kind of a workshop on something related to undergraduate research and creative activity. This month I thought we would start by talking about skill level acquisition, and you'll see what I mean by that in a minute. Next month, as you'll find out in a second, we're going to talk about research literacy. And then the December one, which will be right before the end of the semester, probably a week, I think, after we come back from Thanksgiving, we'll do a workshop on the new travel fund and talk about how to apply for that. We've got rolling out a new travel fund. So let me start here at the beginning. So I had talked a little bit about this when I came over the summer for my campus interview. This is my 3rd week here, so students can appreciate that when you're new and don't know anybody. It took me 5 minutes to figure out how to get the screen on. But I talked about this a little bit when I came, and it's the idea that regardless of what point you're at in your learning process, you could engage in undergraduate research and some kind of creative work. And so this is geared both towards the students and towards the faculty who sometimes think, oh, I'm a freshman, I don't know anything, how am I going to do research? Or I'm getting involved in some area that is out of my depths because I'm really not an expert in that yet. How am I going to do research in that area? So let me talk a little bit about that and start with a story. I went to Fordham University as an undergraduate, started there in the fall of '81, so I guess I'm old, and was in Brit Lit the first semester. I was an English major. I've been an English professor for close to 30 years. And I sat in that Brit Lit class. I was not an English major at that point. In fact, I was a political science major. I did not like English. I did not like reading. And on the syllabus was to read Jane Eyre's Wuthering Heights. How many people have read Jane Eyre's Wuthering Heights somewhere in your, and I'm not going to quiz you, somewhere in your life. And we had to read the book. Long book. And I wasn't a real reader at that point, which is hilarious now in retrospect if you come and see my library. I didn't have a clue what the hell was going on. I had no idea. I could barely follow the plot, never mind do any kind of analysis, because I was not equipped to do that yet at that point. Every night I read, and once a week we had reading quizzes. I flunked every one of them. I read the book, but what happened was I was just reading the words on the page. I wasn't really comprehending what I was doing. I wasn't processing any of that. And I finally realized this that day that girl spoke up. I remember where I was sitting in the classroom, as many years ago as this is, and the teacher asked a question, and a young woman sitting over there from where I was sitting raised her hand and gave an answer and was complimented by the professor for giving such an interesting and insightful answer. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, I may have said it out loud, where the hell did she see that? Because I didn't see that, and I read the same book. So I ended up looking like this. You know, like, well, this is a losing battle. I'm reading. It's not working. I'm not getting anything here. So I wanted to be Yoda. You want to be the expert, right? But you got to start out, you know, as young Luke, those of you who know your Star Wars, who can't do anything and knows nothing. So what I discovered many years later, is that these 2 guys named Dreyfus, I'll tell you more about them in a second, designed this thing called the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition. And what they said was there's a learning continuum. And it goes from novice all the way up to expert. And I'll talk more about each one of these steps in a second. There are 2 brothers. Both of them were at UC Berkeley. One was in industrial engineering. The other one was in philosophy. So there's an interesting mix. And it provided for an interesting take on things. They originally published this idea in 1980 and then again in '86. And actually, if you Google it, you can download the original article, which is only 5 typewritten pages. It's way before computers. you know, in a PDF. And the article's not that insightful. It's what's been done with it since. It really is a developmental model. In the article, they say, everyday concrete experience in problem solving builds on theory and abstract concepts. So you begin with learning theory, you move to the hands-on and the experiential. And the argument here is that that movement should happen rather quickly. Because if all you're doing is sitting in the classroom learning about the theory, and you never get the opportunity to apply it, it's not going to work. I come from an institution that had a big education college. We had these students in education classes for 3 years, and they didn't go to their student teaching until they were seniors. That seemed crazy. And in fact, I was at a meeting in Washington, D.C. about 2 years ago where that particularly was discussed. And the idea that the federal government is trying to encourage states to try to get students who are going to be high school and elementary school teachers into the classroom much earlier than waiting until they do their student teaching senior year. So the Dreyfuses argue that there's 5 steps. Other people have adapted this over the years and added more. You know, there's always that kind of thing. Novice, advanced beginner, competent, proficient, and expert. They say those are the sort of the 5 steps in skills acquisition. A good way to look at this is to think about driving. I assume that everybody in the room drives. Yes? 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 Good. Okay. You'd be surprised how many students these days don't get driver's licenses. You probably know people who don't drive. I have actually taught students to drive in the college parking lot on occasion because they didn't have a license. They argue this. The novice stage has these characteristics. The novice usually has an incomplete or rudimentary understanding of the topic. The novice approaches tasks mechanistically, needs supervision to complete the tasks, has little situational perception. I'll talk more about what I mean by that in a minute. They don't really have any discretionary judgment. Their knowledge might be acquired, but without any reference to context. So you're learning how to do something almost in a vacuum, because you really can't relate it to something else. So think about when you sit in a classroom learning driver's ed, right? It really is kind of idiotic when you think about it that, you know, you sit in the classroom and the teacher in the front says, and then you shift into drive. And you're like, everybody sits there and goes, you know, how does that work, right? Or you're thinking about all this in theory. Now you need that right at the beginning, right? You need that theoretical bit. But it is important for you really to get right into the car. Maybe not have it go anywhere yet, but to be sitting in the car. I mean, how many of us when we were kids sat in the driver's seat? It's not brand new to you then, right? So the novice is the student driving, right? And again, if I go back to this slide, usually has an incomplete, rudimentary understanding of the topic. So you sort of know what you're doing, but you don't really have the experience. You approach things mechanistically. So you know, what's the first thing that you're told to do when you get into a car? When you're going to drive? Seatbelt, put your seatbelt on. Second thing, see if you can remember. Check your mirrors, right? So you go through every single step because you're doing it very much by rote. Need supervision to complete tasks. I mean, nobody's going to throw a new driver into a car without a teacher sitting there in the passenger seat, hopefully with their own brake pedal over there, right? At least that's what we hope. And again, the situational perception I'll talk about in a second. So the student driver, you know, 10 and 2, right? So you can always recognize it because they're sitting, you know, like this, right? Very stiff, and not. I mean, you know, then later on you're driving with one finger, you know. No problem. So that student driver again needs the teacher sitting next to them. And one example of this is when you change lanes, right? When you change lanes when you are a novice driver, it can be nerve-wracking. In fact, some novice drivers just won't change lanes. I have a good friend who is not a novice. She has been driving for a long time. She refuses to go anywhere that requires a left-hand turn. She will not make it. She will actually drive a longer way around so that she can only make right-hand turns because she's too crazy about making left-hand turns. I find it hilarious. She also drives this little marshmallow car, which is kind of funny. But you know, learning how to change lanes effectively and efficiently, learning when to go, when there's enough space, that only occurs with the experience of having sat in the car and doing it, right? Now, you're not going to learn that in a classroom, right? You're going to learn the rules about it, but the actual hands-on doing it, not going to happen until you're in the car. The advanced beginner then has a working understanding of the topic, tends to see the actions as a series of steps, and those steps start to become connected. You start to make the links. They can begin to complete simpler tasks without supervision. They begin to employ those situational skills. They can appreciate the acquisition of new knowledge in context. So it's not that they're learning everything in pieces. They're starting to be able to put it all together and make some sense. So parallel parking is always a challenge for new drivers, right? The advanced beginner can sometimes run into problems, and sometimes people never get the parallel parking down, right? I mean, especially if you live in an area where it's not really necessary to parallel park. I grew up and lived a lot of my life in New York City. I know how to parallel park. I'm very proud of the fact that last fall I took 12 students down to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in a 12-passenger van, which is one of those big honking vans, and parallel parked it on the Upper West Side in one shot and got it in there. I was very proud of that. I was also even more proud of the fact that I found a spot that was big enough. That's neither here nor there. So, you know, if you stand and watch people parallel park, you can sort of see what level they're at when it comes to parallel parking, right? You either sort of know it and you're zip and you're in and they're out, or they're one of these people that it takes them 15 minutes and it's almost like watching the Keystone Cops when you're watching them, right? They back in, they pull out, back in, they're changing it around. The next level, the competent person, has good working and background understanding of the topic, can see the actions partly in context, is able to complete the work independently to an acceptable standard that might lack refinement. When it comes to driving, I think about somebody who might have a permit at that point, right? They're allowed to drive, they need somebody else in the car with them because it's still a check, but they're beyond the point when it's the student driver. They see knowledge in the context of the bigger picture, right? But the bigger picture may still be a little out of focus. And again, I'll make this even more clear for you in a second. The next step, the proficient, has a deep understanding of the topic, sees the actions holistically. So sees the actions as being a part of the greater whole and is able to achieve a high standard. So, you know, if you can go around turns, it's one thing to go around turns, it's another thing to be able to do it like that. Right? If you can really take a turn, you're proficient. The expert then has an authoritative or deep holistic understanding of the topic, can deal with routine matters intuitively, talk more about that in a second, and is able to go beyond existing interpretations to the creation of new knowledge or knowledges. Has the vision thing, right? The expert is able to see beyond what's in front of them, right? So I like this thing from the 1940s, Happy Expert Driver, because they look so happy. Situational adaptation. Let's talk about that for a second, because I like this idea because it really speaks to what they're talking about in this Dreyfus model. It is the ability of the new learner to adapt to the situation as it changes. The novice has trouble doing that. The expert can do it just like that, right? And I think about, you know, starting with repetition, mimicry, rote action, right? Those of you who are old enough recognize that this is Harpo Marx, and that is Lucille Ball, and I Love Lucy. And there was a famous scene where they did this mimicry thing as if there was a mirror in between them, although there wasn't. But let me give you a more modern example. Well, let's take one. I'm assuming
Io.
assuming familiarity with this. I'm going to stop for a second. You young folks in the crowd, you know the Karate Kid?
Yeah, I saw the Jackie Chan version.
Okay. Yeah, God, I'm sorry. All right, so Mr. Miyagi's going to teach him karate.
Yeah, but I... Wax on, right hand. Wax off, left hand. Wax on, wax off. Breathe in through nose, out the mouth. Wax on, wax off. Don't forget to breathe. Very important. Wax on.
So the novice is doing things, doesn't really see how it fits into the bigger picture at all.
Wax on. Detroit.
So, you know, how is any of this going to fit into his understanding of karate? It doesn't feel like it is clear and that it has any kind of application.
Wax on. Right hand, make a circle. Wax off, left hand, circle. Wax on, wax off. Breathe in, breathe out. Wax on, wax off. Wax on, wax off.
Okay, so that's our novice, right? Then you can start to put the pieces together.
Sand floor. Sand floor. Big circle. Sand floor. Sand floor. Yes. Now show me wax on, wax off. Hey.
Wax on, wax off.
Wax on, wax off. Hey. Wax on, hat. Wax off. Concentrate. Look at my eye. Not the hand. Thumb inside. Wax on, hat. Wax off, hat. Wax on, hat. Wax off, hat. Wax on.
So he still doesn't really know what the hell's going on. He's following these instructions,
Show me paint the fence.
but none of it's coming together.
Up, down, up, down. Other side. Look, I always look at it. Show me paint the house. Say. Knock wrist. Side. Yes. Show me wax on, wax off. That! Show me paint the fence. That! Show me side to side. That! Show me sand on floor. Stop! Hey. Look, I always look, I. Come back tomorrow.
So what happened in that scene? What happened to Daniel as far as moving along on this continuum? By the end of that scene, he's no longer a novice. He's moved into advanced beginner. He's starting now to see. You can see it in his eyes there at that point when all of a sudden, oh, it's connected. I'm starting to get this now, right? So this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. You get a student who comes in, and let's give a on-the-ground example, right? So I often get people saying, especially in the humanities, students can't do undergraduate research in the Middle Ages because they don't have the language skills, right? In order to do work in the Middle Ages, you really need to have, if you're working with me, just as an example, you need to have a proficiency in Latin and probably be pretty good with French as well. And students probably don't have that. Never mind that it's medieval Latin, which is different than classical Latin, which, so it's all this, right? So how are students going to do that? Well, there are ways of having entry points for them at various points along there. You might have a student who's coming in at the novice stage who's doing very rudimentary kind of work that needs to be done. So for example, I'll use myself as an example. The first book that I wrote was on a medieval Bible. I had a lot of different pieces in that puzzle that needed work. I had a student who wanted to do research with me at one point, and she had no language skills whatsoever. So I knew she couldn't do that part. But she was really a good student and was enthusiastic about wanting to do the work. I wanted to find some way of letting her get into this. Well, I had one piece of the research that was looking at medieval manuscripts, looking for images of people reading or writing and sitting at a desk. It's pretty simple kind of work, but it involved going through manuscripts and becoming a little bit more literate as far as manuscript work is concerned, and the way that they're laid out, and the way that they're numbered, and the way that they're indexed, so that she was able to come up with that compilation of those images. I had another student working on the same project when I was working on that book who was more proficient in Latin. And so I was able to have her do some transcription of some of the Latin texts that I needed because she could do that. One was much more advanced than the other. Both had meaningful experiences, though, as undergraduates doing that kind of research. So the next stage, of course, is that adapting to the situation. Right? And so he finally does that in the final scene of the film. Whoops. Which I was watching earlier and it knows it. How does it know all this? If not an expert, he's certainly close to it at this point. He's gotten all that learning down, and look at how far he's come from that first scene with paint the fence and wax on, wax off. Right? So the bully, he played bully in every movie in the 80s. Gets his leg like that, and Daniel is going to perform a move that he'd never done before, but in the situation, he's able to adapt what he already knows and make it work. He nearly broke his leg and he got a warning. I always thought that was something wrong. So there's the intuition and the adaptability, right? Adapting to the situation. Never done that before. But here he was able to adapt to the situation based on what he had learned in order to make that work. So the traits and capabilities of each one of these levels, and I'm going to eventually, when we have the OURCA intro website up, I'm going to upload these PowerPoints. I'm attempting to videotape these for people who can't get to the workshops, and we'll post the links there. We're just getting there. But each one of these steps, this again is a sort of summation of what I had said before. I'm not going to read through all the slides, but each one of these steps indicates further fluency in the process. So the question is, how do you move from one level to the next? Right? So how do you move from novice to advanced beginner? It doesn't necessarily equal time and years. So people say, well, I've been doing this for so long. Right? So, doesn't matter. Right? I mean, as a freshman in college, I've been reading since I was, 3 years old. Didn't seem to make any difference. How many times have we heard in a college environment that, students don't know how to read? We don't mean they don't know how to read. We mean they don't know how to read. They can't comprehend. They don't know how to process what they're looking at. They can read the words on the page. I remember when my daughter first learned to read, that was a big thing. Right? She was a really advanced reader very early on. Both me and my wife were English professors. And so she was a very advanced reader early on. She could read just about anything. She didn't know what the hell she was reading, but she could read the words on the page. That's not reading, right? So it doesn't necessarily equal time and years put in. You get regression when faced with a new situation, right? So, sometimes it's, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? There's a little bit of that kind of movement along the continuum. But a big part of this, and you'll see in a minute, I think, is taking that chance. If you're going to be stuck in that novice role because you're afraid to sort of move forward in doing what you're doing, whether it's learning something new, whether it's learning a skill or a hobby or just about anything, right? I mean, you're not going to progress. The transition takes time and it takes experience. That's the thing, right? So I say, it doesn't equal time and years, it's time and experience. It's experiential learning. It's reasoned practice. It's gaining the habit and the understanding of deliberation, of pulling back and reflecting on what it is that you're seeing. If you look at that last scene when he performs the crane move, right, you can see the look on his face when he sort of put all the pieces together. And Mr. Miyagi standing over there looking at him going, yeah, he's got it. You move more quickly to the next level. You apply prior learning, you see what the core concepts are, you see how the concepts can be applied in a new situation. So you take the original concepts, and again, if you go back and look at that film, it's a good example. Look at the wax on, wax off, and then watch that last scene when he's fighting for the championship to see how he's using those same skills. They're there, right? They're there, but they're being applied in a new situation. And that's what he was trying to teach him to begin with, right? It wasn't about waxing his cars or painting the fence, although he got his fence painted. So what supports this transition along these levels, right? Here are these young guys learning to be Jedi Knights, right, in Star Wars. To foster competence and confidence, we use reflection, questioning, storytelling, feedback, experience, and success to foster development. Now let me talk about this from the perspective of a professor. So if I have a novice working on a project, I'm going to constantly be checking in with him or her and asking them to reflect on what it is that they've been doing, to constantly ask questions. I will never berate them for asking questions, right? No question is too small, and no question certainly is stupid. To tell stories. Sometimes that might take the form of just keeping a journal of the work that you're doing, right? What are you learning? And then reflecting back on that. So what I do with a new research student is I'll have them keep a daily journal of the work that they're doing. And I will have them at different points in the year, the academic year, go back and reread what it is that they did and write a reflection at that point. So they're constantly kind of checking in with themselves. I don't really look at the journal unless they want me to see it. It's really for them. I don't tell them that at the beginning, but it's really for them, right? For that reflection. Feedback, really important to get feedback, right? I mean, we all need it, right? So they want feedback, they want to know, is this the right way to go? I don't, because that's how they're going to get that situational adaptation, the experience and the success. It's supporting holistic learning. So although Mr. Miyagi is showing him at first how to wax the car, it almost immediately grows into taking a bigger picture. By the end of that day, you have the end of that scene where he goes at him and he sees, oh, the pieces are starting to connect. Because there's nothing that's more sort of demoting or to kill your spirit, to go home at the end of the day and think, I did all that work and what the hell have I got, right? You need to see how the pieces are starting to be put together. When I teach the Bible as Literature course, I'm a medievalist. When I teach the Bible as Literature course, students tend to get frustrated in the first couple of weeks of the course because it seems like there are a lot of little pieces. And I always promise them that in about a week or two, you'll start to see how the pieces fit together. You got to trust me, right? Last year I taught a seminar on heaven and hell. It's a lot of stuff, a lot of little pieces. And I actually put up a picture of a sculpture from Philadelphia of this huge funnel. And at the end of the funnel is a tree is beginning to grow. And so we talked over the course of the semester about the things that we were learning and what are we throwing in the funnel. Because then by the time you get to the end, you get the tree starting to grow, right? So we were talking about, is that something we need to throw in the funnel today? Is that something that we learned today? Focus on concrete, critical thinking development, questions, discussion. Right, real open. Clearly defined expectations. What am I expecting from you when you're doing this research? So when I had my student looking for those images in manuscripts of people reading or writing, the obvious question was, well, what are you expecting me to find, right? And I said from behind my desk, I have no idea, because I didn't. I didn't know whether or not there were images, a lot of images of people reading or writing. That's what I needed her to look for, right? So the expectation was, we're both searching for this. I don't know the answer any more than you do. You've got the opportunity to really discover something new here, right? You're teaching me. Plan for the learning process, real big. Any research project that you're working on with a student, real important to have a plan where you're going, right? Especially if they're coming in at that novice level. So the learning environment, some things that professors have always heard, right? Move from simple to complex, success builds success, allows practice, failure, really big, right? We're becoming more in tune now with the importance of failure in the learning process. Allow time for learning and discussing, feedback, correction, change direction, right? I always tell students that research is like being in a dark room and there's a door somewhere. And you're kind of walking around in it looking for the door. And what's going to happen is the process. You're going to walk into a lot of walls. And like the Roomba, you know, you're going to walk into the, you know, and you're going to turn around and go a different way, right? I mean, that's the way it works. That's what research is, right? How many of us have had students come in, you require that they use 4 secondary sources for a project. Students help me with this, right? And you go out and you read 10, right? And then you come in and you say, well, you know, I read 10, and I found 4 that were helpful. Can I include all 10 in my paper? And you're like, well, no, because the other 6 weren't really helpful. They said, well, I wasted my time on the other 6. What's the response? That's research, right? You learned a hell of a lot by doing that, though, because in the process, what you can do is you can file away a lot of those little nuggets that you learned, and you can pull them out of your arsenal later on when you come across something else, something new. That's one of the things that's lost now by the fact that so much of the reference stuff is available online. It's no longer where you go over to the stacks and pull a book off a shelf and just start looking through it for something, and you come across something that you weren't looking for, and you go, oh, I never knew that before, right? You're less likely to find that when you're looking online because you're going directly to what it is that you want. Do one brave thing and run like hell. Really important in research, right? You got to take a chance. You got to take a chance. Now, my student who worked for a semester looking for images of people writing and reading in medieval manuscripts looked through hundreds of manuscripts online in the British Library Archive and in the Bibliothèque Nationale Library. And she found very little. Right? It wasn't frustrating for her because she learned a tremendous amount along the way. Right? It didn't pan out the way that I had hoped it would because I needed that information. I'm sure it didn't pan out the way that she'd hoped it would. But what we did is, as she was going through this process and not finding things, we started questioning, well, what does that mean, that we're not finding something? So don't forget to celebrate accomplishments, right? A big part of what we're going to do in the OURCA is really support students going to conferences and presenting, publishing their work. Lots of outlets to publish now for undergraduates. Competitions for people who are in the creative arts in particular. Performances. But don't forget the importance of the pat on the back, right? It's a dog patting another dog on the back, right? I mean, that's really important, right? We don't do that enough. What about the role of intuition here, right? I mean, Einstein said that the only real valuable thing is intuition. So what's the role of intuition in learning and research? And you see that a little bit in the Karate Kid, because a lot of what's happening there when he's doing that is really intuition. Right? He's got to sense what's going on. Now, I'm not talking about, you know, clairvoyance and 1-900 numbers. I'm not talking about that. That's not what we're talking about. It's more the intuition on Maslow's scale. So those of you who are from the psych world know this well, and education world. Right? This idea that at the bottom we've got instinct, which is what we need instinctually. Water, sleep, food. We move up to reason and logic, and finally to intuition. And you'll see up at the top there is purpose, creativity, inward focus. That's what really the expert is able to acquire in the progression. I like this image because it really kind of shows the progression here, right? Knowledge is the dots, experience helps you connect the dots, creativity is really connecting the dots in a meaningful way. So it's really that stages, right? The novice can do this. The expert can do this. So there's the reference for the Dreyfus piece. Again, we're going to have an OURCA open house, Halloween, 1 to 5, come in costume. Office is right downstairs on the first floor here, 161. Stop by at any time. It's a little empty. Michaela and I are in there, but it's a little empty at the moment. We're getting there, slowly but surely. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'd love to have some questions and discussions. So please let me open it up here. And please eat cookies. My wife would tell you, please eat the cookies. So he doesn't eat the cookies. What do you think? Yeah.
Well, in Natural and Behavioral Science College, in order to give students undergraduate research credit, we have to have syllabi
Right.
that spell out a lot of what you were
Sure.
talking about. So I think that that's a great place to indicate that. And there's also a separate agreement that we have to fill out with the schedule.
Absolutely.
For the
Yeah.
semester or whatever block of time.
That's the scaffolding, right? You need that scaffolding. You can't just get turned loose. I mean, even those of us who are experienced researchers usually have some kind of scaffolding, right? I mean, I've got things up on the wall all the time with sketching out, you know, where I'm going with this and what's happening. So definitely. Yeah. Other comments, questions? Insights, stories? Stories are good. You have stories of success?
I just wanted to say one other thing about storytelling.
Yeah.
I really don't think it can be undersold.
Yeah.
It's well, one of those two.
Oversold.
Oversold.
It can be
Too
undersold.
often undersold, right?
Yes.
But what I've been seeing even with freshman honor students is that if you do a little storytelling and you give them the chance to do
Yeah.
it too, all of a sudden they're not just telling their story or what they've heard about something, but now they're really listening to each other.
Yeah.
And you can kind of step away and just allow them to have those conversations.
I think you're right. I mean, that sharing of those stories is also an incredible learning experience and an opportunity. That's why I like to tell a lot of stories about my own experiences with research, because the same reason. It gives the opportunity to see, again, the real, what is it really like, right? I mean, people think different things about research, right? I mean, you know, I love this, right? You know, I mean, you should be more explicit here in step 2, right? Because everybody thinks you get to the end and it's like, boom, it all happens. The process is, I mean, for those of us who do research, the process itself can be unbelievably painful and unpleasant. I mean, it reminds me of what Dorothy Parker said, right? You know, she loved having written but hated writing, right? I love having done research. Doing research I enjoy, but I mean, I got to admit, there are certain days when you want to go home and just, you know, hit yourself in the head with a hammer and just put an end to it. It works in different ways and in different disciplines. I mean, that's one of the things that's really important to also recognize is this experience is different in different disciplines, right? We are not going to turn you loose in the lab with the big vat of sulfuric acid on day 1. That would be really stupid, right? For the same reason that I'm not going to say, you know, go to the library and start working with these manuscripts on day 1. There's a learning process, right? But I think part of it is not shutting down and saying, as I hear often from students, oh, I don't know enough to do that. Well, you will, right? You will, and that's the thing. But you're not going to do it unless you try, unless you get into it. You know, it's a bad analogy because I'm terrified of the water, but you're not going to learn to swim until you jump in the pool, right? You can't, I mean, I know how to swim. I get it. I understand the physics of it. I can't swim. I'm afraid of the water, right? But you're not going to know how to do that until you get in there. You can learn how to drive a car sitting in the classroom. You're not going to learn how to drive a car sitting in the classroom. It's not going to work. And some of this is also, you know, again, that level bit, right? So the novice driver knows how to turn, well, you know, we don't even turn keys anymore. Push the button and turn the car on. You know, and the expert may know how the internal combustion engine works, right? But the novice doesn't need to know that to make it work. Other questions, comments?
So, what kind of resources do you have in terms of taking products with students and getting them into either, publication or
Yeah.
into, and how does that work? I mean,
Good question. What's your field?
I'm a historian.
Okay. There's a growing number of journals, peer-reviewed journals, that publish undergraduate work, particularly in the humanities and social sciences. It's kind of staggering the way that this has grown over the last decade. And eventually on the website we'll have a list of those sources for different disciplines, as well as conferences where they can present, because not all conferences allow undergraduates to present. So the ones that do will have those listed as well. It's going to be an ongoing thing, and I'm going to need the faculty's help to compile that, obviously, because I don't know every area. But there are some really good undergraduate journals that publish work. I had a student a couple of years ago wrote a paper on Philip Roth. She was doing Jewish American literature with me, and it was a really good paper. And at the end of the semester, I had said to her, you really should submit this for publication. And over the summer, we went through it and did a couple of revisions, and she submitted it to an interdisciplinary journal that's published in California. That's a journal for undergraduates, and it was published. It took 2 years, but it was published.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was suggesting. I mean, usually publication takes a while.
Yeah.
And students graduate.
Yes. And it did take a while. She was long gone by the time it published. Yes. She had graduated. She was in graduate school by that point. And it was 2 years later. But eventually it did happen.
Yeah, just as a follow-up to that question, I was wondering about that as well. Like, there's an undergraduate journal in musicology.
Yeah.
And I had a student, after 2 years of working with her, which had something, but then she wouldn't be an undergraduate anymore.
But I think if they're an undergraduate, when the work was conducted, most journals will accept it.
Okay.
Yeah.
They can submit.
Yeah,
So
they can
like
submit
at the
it.
time of submission, as long as you're
Right.
an undergraduate, usually.
So my student who published that paper on,
And then they assume the time is gonna move forward,
Right.
and so then if they've graduated or whatever.
the
afterwards.
student who published the paper on Philip Roth, she submitted that when she was still an undergraduate. Wasn't published until she was in graduate school, but that didn't matter. It was accepted earlier on. But yeah, making that clear certainly is important. But really good opportunities. Good opportunities to do this. We've got the cupola, which students can submit to. We've got Paideia to present at the end of the year. We've got other conferences that you can attend. I'm trying to get a contingent of students who might apply to NCUR this year, which is the National Conference on Undergraduate Research. If you're interested, come and see me, students. Really love to take some students there this year. I've taken students to NCUR every year since 1990. It's a really good opportunity. And it moves around the country every year. But if you don't know about NCUR, it's a very large conference. About 3,000 undergraduates go every year from institutions all over the country, from the Harvards to the little dinky places and everything in between. And the nice thing about it is it's a 3 or 4 day event, and it's a great networking opportunity. And there's a very large graduate student fair as well. So a lot of graduate schools will come to NCUR, look at the program, see that, oh, you're presenting a paper on neuroscience that sounds really interesting. I'm going to go and hear your paper. And then they come up to you at the end and they say, I'm from such and such a university. Are you thinking about graduate school? And you say, why, yes, I am. I say, well, here's my card. Right? They just heard your paper. It was almost as if they've gotten an interview right at the beginning. They've heard a little bit of your work. It's a great opportunity. You were going to say.
Yeah, when's the deadline for submissions for that?
To NCUR, it's at the beginning of December.
Okay.
I believe it's December 3rd this year. I just looked at it the other day. So if students are interested, please have them come and see me as soon as possible, because I'd love to help them with it. Because it's a little bit different than submitting to other conferences. It's a little bit of a different process, and knowing sort of who's reading the submissions and how it's getting vetted. And since I've done that already, I'd be happy to help them. I think it's going to be NCUR will be particularly helpful for students in the humanities, because in many of the humanities, undergraduates are not permitted to present at our disciplinary conferences, or they're less likely to get accepted. And so NCUR might be a good outlet for that, whereas there are some fields like leadership studies where students can present, undergraduates are permitted to present at their national conference, correct? And that's not the norm in a lot of other fields, and I'm starting to get the lay of the land with that as I meet with individual departments on which disciplines permit it and which don't, so we can have a better sense.
So where is NCUR?
NCUR this year is in the lovely state of Oklahoma. Yes, I hear it's lovely there. At the University of Central Oklahoma, I believe. They seem to have a knack for picking places that are really hard to get to. It's in Edmond, Oklahoma. You know, we can get students there, and I would love to go with them and bring them to the conference. As I say, it moves around every year, so they try to move it around regionally throughout the country. Trying to remember, it's been in North Carolina several times at Asheville. So it's been, I think that's probably the closest to here that I can remember it. Yeah.
I have a question, sort of a giant step back.
Sure.
I'm seeing only a fraction of the students who are even interested
Yeah.
in this, and they claim they don't have time.
Right.
I'm hoping that we say, actually, you can do this, but
Right.
are we talking about strategies to get them down,
Yeah,
to start this path?
I think that's part of why I was hired.
Yeah.
Was to talk to students and faculty, and with students to deal with some of those questions that come up with, you know, I don't have time, I don't see the real value of this, I don't understand how it fits into the bigger picture. And also, more importantly, is once they do conduct undergraduate research, how do you talk about it? Because a lot of the times what happens is students conduct undergraduate research projects, then it comes senior year, they're getting ready to graduate, go to graduate school, law school, med school, out into the real world, and they go on a job interview and somebody says, did you conduct undergraduate research? And they, not really. They don't really know how to talk about it and how to explain it. And so one of the things that I'm going to do at some point is, we'll probably do a workshop on, you know, how do you discuss your research? Because those of us who are in this field know, you know, there's the elevator speech, right? There's the 60-second, you know, you got to have all that down. We all learned that from working on doctoral dissertations, that you needed to have the elevator speech explanation, the 60-second explanation, and then there was the long explanation that no one wanted to hear, right? You need to be able to talk about that. You were telling me a funny story about a candidate for a job here who could not explain what her doctoral work was on. It just didn't make any sense, right? You need to practice that. There needs to be some practice, and it is difficult to explain in many cases what we're working on, especially when you're talking to people who are not necessarily in your field. That's really hard, right? I mean, if I'm talking to another medievalist about, you know, my work on the medieval glossed Bible published in 1481, you know, we're probably going to be speaking the same language. If I'm talking to somebody in chemistry about that, you know, they're going to look, the glazed look is like, what? Glossed Bible? What do you mean? Right? I mean, you know, so we got to figure out how to negotiate that depending on who it is that we're talking with, and learn how to really explain things. I think that's really an important part of being an undergraduate, is to be able to explain what it is that you're doing. And for a lot of us, we went through that because it's really difficult. I mean, I was the only one in my family to go to graduate school. I was the only one in my family to ever go to college. Right? My father's high school educated, my mother was high school educated, and it was very frustrating for me going through undergrad and then to graduate school because I could not explain to them what it was that I was doing because they had no reference point for it whatsoever. My brother drives a truck for a living. My father understands that. My brother goes to work, he works from 9 to 5, he drives a truck, he delivers milk to schools, he comes home, he gets a paycheck. What the hell do I do? Right? You know, I'm having this conversation with him now. He's 90 now and lives still up in northern New Jersey. And when I talked to him on the phone, he said, so what are you doing? Because he knows I'm not a faculty member. At least he started to understand that. It took almost 30 years, but he started to understand that. Now I'm not a faculty member. So what are you doing? My daughter's asking me the same question, right? And my send response so far has been, it's a lot of meetings. So my daughter this morning, she said, so what are you doing? My daughter's 14. She said, so what are you doing today? And I said, oh, I got a workshop to do. I've got some things I got to take care of. And she says, you never tell me anything about the details. She says, you said you had meetings. And, you know, it's like, but it's not going to mean anything. It's difficult, so I got to figure out myself, you know, how to explain that. And I think, you know, with research, it's the same kind of deal. But, well, we're coming up on the end here. So I appreciate your time. I'm going to send out We've got a newsletter that the OURCA is producing called Notes from the Pod. OURCA, whales, pods, get it? Even though OURCA is not spelled O-R-C-A in our thing, but we're fudging it. But a new issue of that, second issue of that will come out on Monday, and I'm going to figure out a way to get that to students as well as faculty. The next workshop is going to be at the beginning of November. It is November the 2nd, I believe. It'll be in the newsletter on research literacy. I'm trying to move the days and times around so that we're not hitting the same time every time we do it, so people can come. And the open house on Halloween, please stop by. Michaela and I have threatened to be in costume.
No, it's happening.
Okay.
I already bought the costume.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll be in costume too. I don't know.
Order is coming to hand out candy in his costume.
Oh yeah, well, I'm sure Phoebe's going to come as well. My daughter and I, Michaela's got Caleb, who's 4, right?
4.
My daughter's 14 now, so we're kind of out of the family thing, but early on we did that. And our best one was the year that she was Curious George and I was the man in the yellow hat. Everybody loved that. So I told her we should bring that back, but she's not, at 14, she's not so happy with that. I don't think that's going to happen. But thank you very much. Please help yourself to a snack. Thank you.